The CEO paid a chef to cook for his son's birthday, but when the little boy whispered, "She cooks just like Mom," everything changed. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop in the comments. I'd love to know. Now let's dive in. What would you do if the person you loved most in this world was gone, and the only thing left to remind you of them was the child you now had to raise alone? That's where this story begins. Kaelen Vance was no ordinary man. He wasn't just a CEO sitting in a tall glass tower. He was a father, grieving, broken, and quietly holding together the pieces of a life that once fell whole. On paper, he had everything: wealth, power, influence. But behind the closed doors of his mansion, when the world stopped watching, all he had was silence. The kind of silence that weighed on his chest every night. The kind that reminded him of her absence. His wife was gone too soon, and their son, Leo, was barely old enough to understand why his mother never came home again. Leo's birthday was only days away, and Kaelen, who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was terrified. Not balloons or candles or guests, but one simple, impossible truth. How could he give his little boy a birthday that didn't feel empty? That's when fate stepped in the form of someone unexpected. A woman with a gift that went far beyond cooking. A woman who would change everything. Kaelen didn't know it yet. He was just a father, trying desperately to make his son smile again. Kaelen Vance was a man the world admired. To his employees, he was a visionary CEO, the kind of leader who always had an answer, always had a plan. But when he came home at night, there were no answers waiting for him, only shadows and a quiet that seemed to stretch endlessly through the empty halls of his house. He tried to be strong for Leo, tried to smile and pretend that everything was fine, yet the weight of loss sat heavy on his shoulders. Every room still carried echoes of his wife, her laughter in the kitchen, her soft voice reading bedtime stories, the way she always knew how to calm their son's fears. Kaelen could still see her in the little details. A framed photo on the shelf, the faint perfume left in the closet he couldn't bring himself to open. Nights were the hardest. Leo would fall asleep clutching a worn stuffed animal, and Kaelen would sit awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was failing as a father. He had built empires, negotiated deals worth millions, and yet, when it came to giving his son the warmth of family, he felt powerless. He kept himself buried in work, convincing himself it was the only way to keep moving forward. But even in the tallest skyscraper office, surrounded by the noise of business, there was an ache that never left him. People envied his success, but no one saw the man who ate dinner alone night after night, wishing for just one more ordinary evening with the woman he loved. The silence of grief is a strange thing. It doesn't scream. It lingers. It waits. And for Kaelen, it was always there in the quiet spaces of his life, reminding him of everything he had lost. And yet, despite the pain, despite the emptiness, he carried on. Because for Leo, he had to. Leo was a bright boy, with eyes that carried more depth than most children his age. He had his mother's smile, that soft curve of the lips that could light up a room. But lately, even his smile seemed a little dimmer. He didn't speak much about her, not directly. Instead, his grief showed in the little ways, like when he lingered at the dinner table, poking at his food as if searching for something that wasn't there, or when he asked questions he didn't quite understand himself, questions that Kaelen often struggled to answer. As his birthday crept closer, Kaelen noticed Leo becoming quieter. Most children buzz with excitement at the thought of balloons and presents, but Leo's excitement was fragile, like a flickering candle. One evening, while Kaelen tucked him into bed, Leo whispered something that caught him completely off guard. "Dad, you think we could have a dinner that feels like home? Like when Mom used to cook?" It was such a small request. Simple, innocent, but for Kaelen, it landed like a stone in his chest. Leo wasn't asking for toys or parties or anything money could buy. He was asking for something no amount of wealth could recreate. The warmth of his mother's cooking, the comfort of her love, served on a plate. Kaelen smiled gently, hiding the ache that pulsed through him, and nodded. "Of course, buddy, we'll make it special." But later that night, when Leo had drifted off to sleep, Kaelen sat alone in the hallway outside his son's room, his hands pressed against his face. How could he give Leo what he wanted? When the only person who knew how to make food taste like home was gone. Leo didn't know it, but with those few words, he had set something in motion, something that would soon bring a stranger into their lives, a stranger whose kindness and cooking would feel more familiar than either of them could have imagined. And so he dialed, not knowing that the woman on the other end of the line was about to change both of their lives forever. The day Elara Thorne arrived, the house felt different. Kaelen hadn't noticed it at first. He was too caught up in his thoughts, wondering if hiring her was a mistake. But when the door opened and she stepped inside, there was a kind of quiet warmth that followed her, like sunlight slipping through a window on a cold morning. Elara wasn't what Kaelen expected. She didn't carry herself with the stiff formality of someone hired for an elite job. Instead, she moved with ease, her smile gentle, her eyes kind, as if she already understood the way of the home she was walking into. She wore no flashy jewelry, no polished perfection, just an apron folded neatly under her arm and a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from love for her craft. Leo was the first to notice. From behind his father's legs, he peeked at the newcomer, curious. When Elara knelt down to his level and introduced herself, her voice soft and playful, his shy expression cracked into something Kaelen hadn't seen in far too long, an unguarded smile. "Do you like helping in the kitchen?" she asked him, her tone carrying the warmth of someone who wasn't just there to cook, but to share. Leo nodded quickly, his eyes lighting up. In that moment, Kaelen felt something shift. His son, who had been so quiet and withdrawn, leaned toward the stranger as if she were someone familiar. While Elara unpacked her ingredients, the house began to come alive. The dull silence was replaced with the sound of clinking pans, the soft rhythm of chopping vegetables, and the faint melody of her humming as she worked. It was ordinary, simple, but in a home that had been silent for so long, it felt extraordinary. Kaelen stood back, watching her. At first, he told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down, he knew it was something else. Elara didn't just bring food into the kitchen. She brought presence, a sense of home that had been missing since the day his wife was gone. And though he would never admit it aloud, as he watched Leo laugh quietly at something Elara said, Kaelen felt the smallest spark of hope flicker inside him. The birthday evening arrived, and for the first time in years, Kaelen's home didn't feel like a museum of silence. Instead, it carried the warmth of life. Soft decorations strung along the walls, the faint glow of candles, and most of all, the scent of Elara's cooking drifting through every room. In the kitchen, Elara moved with quiet grace. The sizzle of butter in a pan, the earthy fragrance of herbs, the comforting aroma of roasted chicken filling the air. It wasn't just food being made. It was love, memory, and home coming back to life. Leo hovered nearby, eager and bright-eyed, sneaking peeks at the dishes, as if each one was a little miracle. He giggled when Elara offered him a taste of something warm from a spoon, his laughter echoing in a house that had grown far too used to silence. By the time the table was set, it looked less like a grand CEO's dining room and more like something tender, almost intimate. Fresh bread in a basket, bowls of creamy potatoes, vegetables glistening with butter, a cake, simple, homemade, glowing with candles that waited for a wish. Nothing extravagant, nothing cold or distant, just a table that felt alive again. Kaelen stood at the edge of it all, quietly watching. He saw the way Leo's eyes sparkled, the way Elara smiled as she served each dish. It was a kind of warmth he thought he'd lost forever. For a moment, he forgot the weight of his position, the loneliness of his nights. He was simply a father, seeing his son happy again. When they finally sat down, Leo clapped his hands in delight. "It's perfect," he whispered, almost to himself. And as they shared the first bites, Kaelen realized this dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a memory in the making, a memory that would carry the taste of comfort, the sound of laughter, and the feeling of something he hadn't dared to believe in for a long time. Hope. The meal carried on with laughter, the clinking of silverware, and the soft glow of candles dancing across the table. For a little while, Kaelen almost forgot that this was his house, his story, his pain. It felt different. It felt alive. He found himself stealing glances at Leo, memorizing the way his son's face lit up With every new dish Elara brought forward, it had been so long since he had seen him this happy. Too long. Leo leaned closer to his plate, savoring each bite, his small hands gripping the fork tightly, as though he didn't want the moment to slip away. Kaelen thought it was just excitement, the kind every child has at a birthday dinner. But then, as Elara gently placed another dish on the table, Leo went quiet. He paused, chewed slowly, and then his eyes softened in a way Kaelen would never forget. He turned slightly, his little voice barely above a whisper. "She cooks just like Mom." The words landed in the air like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples through the room. Elara froze mid-motion, her hand still resting near the dish she had set down. Her eyes flickered briefly to Kaelen, and in that shared glance, she saw the weight of what Leo had just said. Kaelen felt his breath catch in his chest. His son's innocent words struck deeper than any boredom betrayal, deeper than any financial loss he had ever endured. They pierced through him because they carried a truth he hadn't been ready to face, that in Elara's cooking, his son had found something familiar, something he thought was gone forever. For a moment, Kaelen couldn't move. He watched his son, watched the way Leo's small face glowed with comfort, with the kind of peace a child shouldn't even have to crave. And in that fragile moment, Kaelen realized just how much Leo missed his mother. Not just her presence, but the warmth of her love in every simple act, every home-cooked meal that made the world feel safe. Elara slowly lowered herself into her chair, her expression quiet, tender, as though she knew she had stepped into sacred ground without meaning to. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She simply let the silence breathe, respecting the weight of a child's truth. Kaelen swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. He wanted to say something, to reassure Leo, to thank Elara, to fill the silence that now pressed so heavily between them. But nothing came. There were no polished words, no speeches. Only a father, broken open by the simple honesty of his child. Leo, unaware of the storm his words had stirred, continued to eat, his small shoulders relaxing as though he had found comfort in this meal that felt like home. For him, it was enough. For Kaelen, it was everything. Because in that whisper, he realized this wasn't just about food. It was about connection. It was about healing. And it was about the possibility, just the possibility, that maybe the emptiness of his house didn't have to last forever. That night, as the candles burned low and the last pieces of cake were eaten, Kaelen sat in silence long after Leo had gone to bed. Elara quietly gathered the dishes, her presence unspoken yet steady, like an anchor in a storm. He watched her, still hearing his son's words echoing in his mind. "She cooks just like Mom." Those 6 little words had changed everything. In the days that followed Leo's birthday, something in the house began to change. It wasn't sudden, not like a door swinging open. It was slower, gentler, like light slowly seeping through cracks and shutters after a long night. Elara stayed on, at first only to help with meals, but her presence reached far beyond the kitchen. Each evening, the scent of simmering stews, fresh bread, or warm spices would drift through the air, wrapping the house in comfort it hadn't felt in years. The silence that once hung so heavy was gradually replaced by small sounds, Leo's laughter echoing from the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, Elara's soft humming as she worked. For Leo, the transformation was immediate. He began spending hours in the kitchen, perched on a stool beside Elara, watching her chop vegetables or stir pots. Sometimes he'd ask questions. Sometimes he'd just sit quietly, breathing in the smells that reminded him of his mother. Every now and then, Elara would hand him a spoon or sprinkle of seasoning, and his face would light up with pride as though he'd just created magic. For Kaelen, the change was harder to admit. He still carried his grief like an invisible weight, but slowly, he began to notice the difference. Dinner no longer felt like a task, something to get through before retreating to silence. It became a time of connection. He would come home to the sound of Leo telling Elara about his day at school, to the sight of his son's face glowing with happiness he hadn't seen since before his wife passed. One evening, as Kaelen sat at the table watching them cook together, he felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was close. It was the faint memory of what family felt like. Elara never tried to replace what was lost. She didn't overstep, didn't try to fill a role that wasn't hers. Instead, she offered the simple gift of presence. She listened when Leo talked about his mom, nodding with quiet understanding. She cooked meals that didn't just taste good, but felt familiar, as though she had somehow captured comfort itself on a plate. And when Kaelen would walk into the room, weighed down by his day, she would greet him with the kind of warmth that reminded him, without words, that he wasn't entirely alone. It was in the small things that the healing began. In the way Leo laughed with his mouth full of food. In the way Kaelen found himself lingering in the kitchen longer than he needed to, just to be near the sound of life again. In the way Elara treated their home not as a workplace, but as a place worth tending to with care and patience. Night after night, they shared meals together. And night after night, the emptiness that had haunted Kaelen's home grew just a little smaller. He still carried his grief. He still missed his wife with every beat of his heart. But sitting at that table, watching his son smile, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, their broken world could be stitched back together. Not perfectly, not the same, but whole in a new way. And though Kaelen hadn't said aloud, he knew the truth. It was Elara who had brought that light back, not through grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but through the quiet, steady rhythm of food, friendship, and kindness. The kind of healing that sneaks up on you when you aren't looking. Until one day, you realize it's already begun. As weeks turned into months, Elara's presence no longer felt like that of a guest. She became part of the rhythm of the household, woven into the fabric of their days in ways Kaelen hadn't expected. What began as simple meals had grown into something deeper, something harder to name. For Leo, the bond was effortless. Children have a way of loving without hesitation, of giving their hearts fully when they feel safe. And with Elara, Leo felt safe. He began waiting by the door for her to arrive, his little feet tapping eagerly on the floor. He started drawing pictures of their dinners together, stick figures at a table, always with Elara seated beside him. At bedtime, when Kaelen tucked him in, Leo sometimes whispered, "Do you think Elara will come tomorrow?" His innocent words carried no weight of loss, no hesitation. To him, Elara had simply become part of his world. Kaelen noticed, and though part of him felt relief that his son was finally smiling again, another part of him wrestled with guilt. Watching Leo laugh so freely in Elara's company stirred something bittersweet inside him. It warmed him to see his son happy, yet it also reminded him of the void they were still learning to live with. Could allowing Elara closer mean letting go of the memory of his wife? Was he betraying the love he had lost by letting another person step into their lives? At the same time, Kaelen couldn't deny what he saw. The way Leo's laughter filled the house again. The way Elara's voice softened when she spoke to his son, never rushed, always patient. The way she seemed to know instinctively when Leo needed comfort or when Kaelen needed quiet. She didn't force herself into their grief. She simply walked alongside it, steady and sure, until it no longer felt so heavy. There were small moments that lingered with Kaelen. An evening when Leo fell asleep at the table, his cheek pressed against Elara's arm as she read aloud from a recipe card, her voice gentle and soothing. A morning when Leo woke early and proudly carried a tray of messy pancakes to his father, proudly announcing that Elara had shown him how. Or the day Kaelen overheard Leo, speaking to no one in particular, softly saying, "It feels like home again." Each moment was a reminder of the bond forming before his eyes, a bond between his son and a woman who had started as a stranger but now felt like family. And though Kaelen's heart wrestled with doubt and longing, he couldn't ignore the truth. Elara wasn't just cooking meals. She was helping them remember how to live again. And for Kaelen, that realization was as terrifying as it was comforting. Because somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't just about Leo anymore. He was beginning to feel it too. Love has a way of slipping in softly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize it's been there all along. For Kaelen and Elara, it wasn't fireworks or dramatic confessions. It was quieter than that, slower. It lived in the in-between moments, in the pauses where silence felt less like emptiness and more like comfort. Kaelen began to notice the little things. The way Elara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she leaned over the stove. The way her laughter, light and unforced, filled the air in a way that made the house feel warmer. The way she listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole presence, when Leo spoke about his day, as if every word he said mattered. In turn, Elara began to see Kaelen differently too. Not as a powerful CEO she had heard about, but as a man who carried the weight of love and loss on his shoulders. She noticed the way his gaze softened when he looked at Leo, the way he tried, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with quiet grace, to be both mother and father. She noticed the rare, fleeting moments when his guard slipped, when he allowed himself to laugh, and for a brief second, the heaviness left his face. There were late evenings when the house was still, Leo asleep upstairs, and Kaelen would find himself lingering in the kitchen. Elara would be cleaning up, humming softly, and he would offer help. Their conversations in those moments were never grand, never rehearsed. They spoke of simple things, favorite childhood meals, small memories of family, stories of mistakes and laughter. And yet, in the simplicity of those exchanges, a quiet intimacy grew. Sometimes their hands brushed as they reached for the same dish. Sometimes Kaelen caught himself looking a moment too long, memorizing the kindness in her eyes before quickly looking away. And sometimes, when Elara laughed at something he said, he felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was never spoken, this growing bond between them, but it lived in the air, in the way Kaelen began coming home a little earlier just to share dinner with them. In the way Elara started leaving small touches of care, flowers in a vase, fresh bread cooling on the counter, Leo's drawings proudly taped to the fridge. In the way Leo's world, once marked by loss, now seemed filled with light because of the two people who stood beside him. Kaelen didn't dare call it love. Not yet. He wasn't sure he was ready. But as he watched Elara laugh with his son, as he listened to her voice soften the edges of their grief, he felt it taking root. Quiet, steady, undeniable. Love wasn't rushing in like a storm. It was growing quietly, like a seed breaking to the soil after a long, harsh winter. And Kaelen, for the first time in years, let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, something new and beautiful was beginning. The moment didn't arrive with fanfare. It wasn't planned, rehearsed, or dressed in perfect timing. It came one evening, after the house had quieted, when Leo had fallen asleep, and the weight of the day had settled into a calm silence. Kaelen and Elara sat at the kitchen table, a soft glow from the pendant light above casting warmth across the room. A plate of half-eaten cookies rested between them. Leo's idea of dessert, though he hadn't lasted long enough to finish them. For a while, they simply talked, as they often did. Small things, gentle things, about Leo's smile, about a recipe Elara wanted to try, about how autumn had started to paint the trees in shades of gold and rust. But underneath the words, Kaelen felt something building, something that had been pressing against his chest for weeks, maybe months, something he could no longer ignore. He glanced at Elara. She was laughing softly at something he'd said, brushing flour from her sleeve. And in that simple moment, he saw it. Saw her not just as a chef who had come into their lives, not just as a woman who had restored light to Leo's days, but as someone he needed, someone he had come to care for in a way that terrified and healed him all at once. His voice faltered before he found the courage to speak. Elara, he began softer than he intended. She looked up, her eyes curious, waiting. He took a slow breath, his fingers curling slightly against the table. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Elara's expression softened, but she didn't speak. She let him find the words. I was lost, Kaelen admitted. After my wife passed, I didn't know how to keep going. I tried for Leo. I tried to be strong. But inside, I was empty. And then you walked into our lives. His gaze dropped briefly, as if the weight of his feelings was almost too much to carry. But then he looked back at her, eyes raw, unguarded. You didn't just cook meals, he whispered. You gave us warmth again. You gave my son laughter. You gave me hope. And somewhere along the way, I realized, he paused, steadying his voice, I don't just admire you, Elara. I care for you, deeply, more than I ever expected to care for anyone again. Elara's breath caught. She had expected this, not tonight, not like this. Her heart raced, her hands stilling on the table. For a moment, she didn't answer. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because emotions flooded too fast, too deep. Finally, her voice came, gentle and trembling. "Kaelen, you've given me something too. A home I didn't know I was missing. A place where I feel needed and loved in ways I never thought I'd deserve." Tears glistened in her eyes, though she smiled through them. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was tender, filled with all the words they didn't need to speak. And then Kaelen reached across the table. Slowly, carefully, his hand brushed against hers. And when Elara didn't pull away, he wrapped her fingers in his. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a sweeping declaration under the stars. It was smaller, quieter. But in that moment, it was everything. Because it was a start something new. For Kaelen, it was the first time he allowed himself to love again without guilt. For Elara, it was the first time she allowed herself to believe she could belong. And for Leo, though he didn't know it yet, it was the beginning of the family he had been wishing for. A confession had been spoken. A new chapter had begun. And in the warmth of that kitchen, with two hands joined across the table, love finally found its voice. The day had finally come. It wasn't extravagant. There were no towering cathedrals, no gilded halls, no hundreds of strangers gathered just for spectacle. Instead, it was simple, beautiful, real. Kaelen and Elara chose to marry in the very place where their story had quietly unfolded, at the small garden behind their home, where Leo had once chased fireflies, where laughter had returned after years of silence, where love had grown not in a rush, but in a gentle, steady bloom. The air was alive with the scent of wildflowers. String lights twinkled above like soft stars caught in a net of branches. Neighbors and close friends filled the rows of wooden chairs, their faces warm with joy, their hearts silently rooting for this family that had fought so hard to find each other. And at the center of it all, Leo. He wasn't just a guest. He wasn't just a child watching from the sidelines. He was the heartbeat of this day. His small hands proudly carried the rings, his eyes wide with excitement, as though he understood more than his age allowed, that today wasn't just about vows between two adults. It was about him too, about belonging, about finally having the family he had whispered to the stars about. Elara walked down the aisle with a grace that was unadorned yet breathtaking. She wore a simple ivory dress, her hair gathered loosely, a crown of tiny blooms resting on her head. She wasn't a bride out of a magazine. She was something better, real, radiant, glowing with a happiness that made her eyes shimmer. Kaelen stood waiting, his suit neat but modest, his expression soft, filled with awe. As he saw her approach, there was no doubt in his heart, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that she was a missing piece he had been searching for, even when he didn't know he was searching. The ceremony itself was tender. Words were spoken not as formality, but as truth. Kaelen's voice trembled slightly as he promised to protect, to cherish, to never take for granted the second chance at love that life had given him. Elara's words were steady, yet rich with emotion. She promised not only to love Kaelen, but to love Leo as her own, to nurture, to guide, to be a constant presence of warmth and strength in their lives. When the rings were exchanged, it was Leo's small hands that placed them gently into theirs, his smile brighter than the lights strung above. And when Kaelen and Elara sealed their vows with a kiss, the garden erupted in applause. Not the thunder of formality, but the heartfelt clapping and cheers of people who had seen them rise from loss and loneliness into this, into family. The reception was filled with laughter. Tables of homemade dishes, many of Elara's recipes perfected with love, were shared between guests. Children ran across the grass, their laughter mingling with the music that played softly in the background. At one point, Leo tugged at Elara's dress, his voice carrying a joy too pure to mistake. "Can I call you Mom now?" The words froze her, tears instantly welling in her eyes. She knelt, gathering him close, her heart breaking open in the best way possible. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "You can." Kaelen, watching them, felt his chest tighten, not with grief, not with longing, but with peace. The kind of peace he thought he'd never feel again. That night, as lanterns floated into the dark sky, carrying light like tiny stars. The three of them stood together, hands intertwined, hearts bound. They were no longer a man, a woman, and a child trying to heal. They were something more. They were a family, whole, complete. And though life would still bring its storms, its challenges, its unpredictable turns, they knew one truth with unshakable certainty. They wouldn't face it alone. Together, they had built something unbreakable. Together, they had created a love that would last a lifetime. The wedding wasn't just the beginning of their marriage. It was a culmination of every quiet hope, every whispered wish, every moment of healing that had led them here. And as the night sky stretched above, endless and full of promise, Kaelen, Elara, and Leo stepped forward into their forever. Hand in hand, heart to heart, a complete family at last. And so, what began as a simple birthday dinner became the start of a brand new family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV for more stories that remind us of love, hope, and second chances.